The first thing you need to understand is that reality, as you know it, is a carefully curated illusion. Some truths are never meant to reach your ears, and tonight I'm going to show you one of them. Imagine lying in a hospital bed, your body broken, your mind barely holding on, and the people you trust the most, those who swore to protect you, turning away. That's exactly what happened to Elaine. She had just suffered a life-altering accident, the kind that strips you of control and leaves you vulnerable in every possible way. Her father, the man who should have been her shield, did not rush to her side. Instead, she received a text message, a single line that cut deeper than any scalpel ever could. "Can't this wait? We're busy." Read that again. Let it sink in. The people who are supposed to love you, who are supposed to anchor you when the world collapses, can and will betray you without hesitation. This is not an accident. This is an unveiling, a test. And the cruelest part is that the world around you, the institutions, the doctors, the very systems designed to protect, are all complicit in a hierarchy of control that thrives on distraction, compliance, and emotional submission. Elaine wasn't just injured in a car accident. She was thrust into the very machinery of human neglect, where apathy and power masquerade as normalcy. In the seconds after that text, something shifted. Pain became a teacher. Betrayal became a revelation. And the papers she would later receive were not just documents. They were keys to a deeper understanding, a hidden ledger of truths no one had the courage to speak. This is the moment most people miss, when the illusion fractures and the silent mechanisms of power reveal themselves. The people who say they care are often the very ones entangled in invisible contracts of greed, secrecy, and control. Tonight, you are going to follow that fracture step by step into a darkness most never survive psychologically intact. We will walk through deception, through family loyalty weaponized, through the subtle, almost invisible manipulation that shapes human behavior without ever raising suspicion. If you're ready to see what lies beneath the polite facade of concern, if you're ready to witness the quiet atrocities that happen when love is conditional and power is prioritized, then lean in. Because what you're about to hear is not just a story, it is a blueprint of hidden truths. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Welcome to the first layer of the labyrinth. There is no turning back after this. After reading that message, Elaine felt something she had never felt before. An icy, hollow kind of abandonment that gnawed at the edges of her mind. It wasn't just disappointment. It was the realization that the people closest to you can turn into strangers in a single heartbeat. And when you're lying in a hospital bed, stripped of your strength and your autonomy, every second stretches like an eternity. Every shadow in that sterile room seemed to whisper, "You are alone now." But it's in those moments, when the world seems to collapse, that the mind awakens. Elaine didn't just lie there and wait. She began observing. Every detail, every passing nurse, every hushed conversation outside her door. The hospital, with all its white walls and blinking monitors, became her stage. And the text? That was the signal. Not a threat, not a warning, but a key. Because soon she would realize that absence isn't always neglect. Sometimes it's preparation. Sometimes it's the quiet hand that forces you to wake up. 3 weeks passed. Pain remained, swelling in her arm, in her leg, in the memory of that single sentence. And then the papers arrived. Ordinary to anyone else, but to her, they were extraordinary. Each sheet a line of reasoning, a subtle acknowledgement of debts and obligations long ignored. Each signature, each number, a silent confession. What she held in her hands wasn't just documentation, it was leverage. It W as power, dormant until she learned to wield it. The irony, Elaine thought, is that life often disguises opportunity in suffering. The same betrayal that shattered her now became the fuel for her resolve. She realized something crucial. Those who dismiss you, those who see your pain as inconvenient, are not your enemies. They are your teachers. And in that lesson, she began to understand a truth most people never reach. The world does not bend to fairness or sentiment. It bends to those who see, who plan, who act, while others are blinded by emotion. And so, with the papers clutched in her hand, Elaine's mind began a silent calculation, not of revenge in its petty form, but of control, of reclaiming her narrative. Because the most dangerous weapon is not the one you strike with in anger, it's the one you cultivate in silence, in patience, while the world continues to underestimate you. Holding the papers, Elaine felt a shift inside her, a quiet, burning clarity. The accident had taken her physical strength, but it had awakened a vigilance she never knew she possessed. Every word her father had sent, Every absence, every dismissive gesture suddenly transformed into a pattern. Not random neglect, not indifference, a careful, deliberate underestimation. And people who underestimate you are dangerous, but more dangerous is realizing you can use that underestimation against them. Elaine began to trace the subtle fractures in her family. Conversations that had once seemed ordinary now revealed hidden hierarchies. The way her father deferred to others in her presence, the way her mother smiled but said nothing, the way her siblings avoided eye contact. Every glance, every gesture, a cipher, a coded map of loyalties and resentments that had existed long before her accident, and it was only visible because she had been forced into the margins, into the shadows where truth often hides. The papers themselves were curious. Legal documents, family ledgers, notes she couldn't fully comprehend at first glance, but they hummed with implication. Each line seemed to whisper, "You have been silent for too long." And Elaine, who had spent years believing family was unconditional, began to understand that love is often transactional, even in the most intimate spaces. It is not the warmth of affection that sustains influence. It is control, patience, and the unseen pressure applied over time. That night, in her hospital room, she began to craft a mental blueprint, not out of malice, not out of childish vengeance, but out of survival. She realized something terrifying and beautiful. The very people who seemed untouchable were only human, flawed, predictable, vulnerable. And power, as she was learning, rarely resides in those who appear strong. It resides in the one who can remain calm while others reveal themselves through their weakness, their arrogance, and their neglect. Elaine's pain had become a lens. The accident, the betrayal, the waiting, it was all preparation. She started to see patterns in the mundane, alignments in the seemingly ordinary events of her life, and understand that her father's dismissive message was not cruelty. It was a mirror showing her what she had ignored in herself: complacency, dependence, a willingness to accept authority without question. And now, for the first time, she would refuse that. She leaned back against the hospital bed, papers in hand, feeling the weight of them as if they were a physical armor. In silence, she vowed not just to recover, but to awaken fully, not just to act, but to see. And in that moment, she knew the story her life had been writing without her awareness was about to be rewritten entirely in her own hand. The first step in reclaiming power is observation. Elaine learned this quickly. From her hospital bed, she began to watch, not just her family, but the world around her, with a predator's patience. Every phone call she missed, every whispered conversation outside her door, every hesitated glance from her father became data. They didn't realize it, but she was cataloging weakness, mapping their predictable responses, and discovering how deeply their pride and fear controlled their actions. The accident had exposed more than her physical vulnerability. It had exposed the fragility of the very people she had once revered. Elaine realized that love, in its purest form, is a tool, not always noble, not always kind, and in the absence of affection, manipulation thrives. Her father's casual dismissal, the way he treated her injury as inconvenience, had been a subtle test. And now, for the first time, she was ready to respond. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with clarity, strategy, and silent, inevitable consequence. The papers were key. Each line held secrets, each signature a window into decisions made behind closed doors. Decisions that had affected her entire life, her opportunities, her autonomy, her sense of trust. The realization hit her like cold steel. She had been surrounded by a carefully constructed illusion, a system that demanded compliance while masking its fractures. And now, having glimpsed the cracks, she understood that the same system could be turned against those who built it. She began to plan meticulously, calculating every interaction, every conversation. A subtle word here, a controlled reaction there. Each gesture would be a test, a probe to see who could be trusted and who would crumble under the weight of exposure. Elaine's body had healed slowly, but her mind had sharpened with terrifying precision. Pain had become a lens, betrayal, a tool, invisibility, a weapon. By the time anyone realized the shift, she would have already rewritten the rules of engagement. And yet, she understood something deeper. Power is not taken in a single blow. It is harvested quietly, cultivated patiently, and applied when the unsuspecting reveal their weaknesses. Elaine was no longer a victim. She was a strategist, a silent force moving through the cracks of her family's world. She could see the fear lurking beneath her father's calm exterior, the hesitations in her siblings' speech, the subtle avoidance in her mother's eyes. Every detail mattered. Every secret, every omission, every calculated act of indifference was a stepping stone toward something larger, something inevitable. That night, staring at the ceiling, Elaine whispered to herself the first truth she would carry forward. Power favors the unseen, the underestimated, the patient, and she would no longer be invisible. The world had been cruel and indifferent, but now it was hers to measure, to probe, and to command, one deliberate step at a time. Elaine learned that silence can be louder than any scream. In the days following the arrival of the papers, she said nothing, watched everything. Her family moved around her like they owned the world, oblivious to the fact that she had already begun to rewrite the rules. Each careless glance, each offhand remark, each faint hesitation became ammunition. Power, she realized, does not announce itself. It creeps into the spaces where arrogance leaves gaps. Her father, once a towering presence in her life, now seemed fragile. Not fragile in body, but fragile in ego, in the subtle cracks that betrayal had revealed. Elaine noticed it in the way he over-explained decisions, in the tremor of impatience when her name was mentioned, in the tiny acts of avoidance that no one else seemed to see. Those gaps, invisible to the unaware, were everything to someone who was finally awake. And Elaine, awake in a way that felt both terrifying and intoxicating, knew how to exploit them without ever showing her hand. The papers she held became a psychological anchor. They were ordinary, bureaucratic, mundane in appearance, but each line represented authority, a ledger of obligations, a map of influence. She traced them slowly, deliberately, memorizing patterns, anticipating moves, and understanding where her levera, GE lay. Power was not in confrontation. Power was in knowing the unseen threads that bound others to their own decisions, their own pride, their own fear. And with knowledge comes inevitability. The world begins to bend toward those who see it clearly. That night, Elaine practiced her first real test, a simple interaction with her father, the casual mention of a detail from the papers. Nothing overt, nothing threatening. But she watched him twitch, watched the subtle signs of recognition cross his face. A slight tightening of the jaw, a pause too long before responding. Fear, not of punishment, but of exposure, passed through him like a shadow. Elaine realized she had crossed the threshold. She was no longer a passive observer. She had become a presence, quiet but undeniable, in a world that had ignored her. And yet, there was more. The deeper truth, the one that humankind rarely admits, is that most betrayal comes not from malice, but from indifference, from habitual self-interest, from the subtle hierarchy that prioritizes comfort over compassion. Elaine understood this now. Her father's text, his dismissive words, they were symptoms, not causes, and in that understanding she found not hatred, but clarity, clarity that would guide every choice, every move, every silent maneuver she would make in the days to come. By the end of that night she whispered to herself, a mantra to steel her resolve. I am no longer waiting. I am seeing. I am acting. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the hospital, in the soft blinking of monitors and the distant footsteps of nurses, the first threads of a new order began to take shape. The papers were no longer just documents. To anyone else they might have seemed meaningless, a pile of signatures, dates, and legal language. But to Elaine, they were a blueprint, a guide to the subtle currents of influence her family had spent decades hiding behind smiles, polite phrases, and the illusion of authority. Every line revealed a choice someone had made, every omission a secret carefully buried, and every secret she now understood was a weapon waiting to be claimed. She began with small tests, a question here, a remark there, carefully phrased to gauge reaction. How did her father flinch when she mentioned certain events? How did her siblings shift when specific obligations were implied? The answers were subtle but telling. People, Elaine realized, always betray themselves under pressure, not with violence, but with hesitation, with inconsistency, with the micro-expressions of guilt and fear. And she was no longer vulnerable enough to be blinded by politeness. The most profound realization hit her as she traced her family's network of influence. Power rarely lies in overt control. It exists in the unspoken expectations, the silent hierarchies, the habitual submission of one mind to another. Her father, once untouchable in his assumed authority, had relied entirely on others' unwillingness to challenge him. That reliance was his undoing. Elaine, who had once depended on him, now stood in the space of clarity he had never given her, and clarity, she discovered, was a form of domination. She rehearsed each interaction mentally, running scenarios where every phrase was deliberate, every pause intentional. By controlling how she responded, she could manipulate the energy of a room, the tension in a conversation, and the subtle sway of perception. The papers became her silent allies, their inked authority amplifying her presence. Every step forward was invisible, yet potent. It was the quiet accumulation of influence that shapes outcomes more decisively than anger, shouting, or brute force ever could. Elaine understood another truth, darker still. Most people will fight only what they see as a threat, never what is quietly inevitable. And inevitability, she had learned, could be cultivated. By observing, by calculating, by using absence as a weapon and presence as leverage, she could force change without raising suspicion. Her family believed she was recovering, weak, compliant, and in that belief they had sealed their own vulnerability. That night she allowed herself a grim smile. The world had underestimated her. Their indifference had forged her strategy. Their neglect had sharpened her perception. And soon, very soon, the silent currents she had begun to manipulate would become undeniable. She whispered to herself, not in defiance but in certainty, "Everything they dismissed will answer to me." By now, Elaine understood a truth most people never face. Fear is not born from threats. It is born from the certainty of exposure. And exposure, she realized, is a force more precise and devastating than anger. Her father, the once imposing figure who had dismissed her pain as inconvenience, now stood on the edge of perception, unaware that she could see every fracture in his carefully maintained facade. Every polite smile, every flustered word, every hesitation in his speech was now under her scrutiny. The first cracks were subtle. A miscalculated phrase here, a slight tremor there, a glance that lingered too long. Elaine leaned in, careful not to provoke, but to measure. In these moments, she discovered the fragile human tendencies that govern even those who seem untouchable. Pride, avoidance, the desperate desire to appear unshaken. And with this knowledge, she realized she could orchestrate outcomes without a single overt confrontation. Influence, she learned, is invisible. It is a quiet gravity that bends the will of others without their awareness. The papers she held, innocuous on the surface, had become instruments of silent domination. Elaine allowed small references to surface, phrases implying oversight, questions hinting at obligations, reminders of actions long buried. Each one planted seeds of unease. She did not need to threaten. She only needed to remind them that their carefully constructed illusions were not as secure as they believed. And the more subtle her movements, the more powerful the effect. There was a dangerous exhilaration in this knowledge. Elaine felt the first true clarity she had ever known. Betrayal, neglect, indifference, all had been tools she had absorbed and transformed into insight. Her pain was no longer passive. It was alchemy, turning weakness into power, neglect into leverage, absence into strategy. And with every interaction, she drew her family further into her orbit, subtly rewriting the rules of engagement without a single word of confrontation. And yet, she knew the moment of revelation would come. They would eventually see her as she truly was, calm, composed, and unavoidable. But until then, she remained the observer, the silent architect of inevitability. Their arrogance, their assumption that she was helpless, was her shield and her weapon. And as she prepared to take the next step, she whispered a quiet command to herself, a mantra to lock in her resolve. I see, I act, I command. This is where the real transformation begins, the moment when patience, clarity, and observation converge into silent, unassailable power. And Elaine, once a victim of circumstance, now stood poised at the edge of inevitability, ready to pull the first thread that would unravel the carefully maintained illusions of those who thought they controlled her world. Elaine had learned that influence is a quiet predator, not a loud one. It does not announce itself. It creeps into moments, takes hold of hesitation, and turns it into leverage. And now, 3 weeks after the accident, she began to see the first tangible signs of her family shifting under her gaze. Her father, once so confident in his authority, now hesitated in conversation, over-explained minor decisions, and avoided certain topics with a nervous glance. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to her it was victory. She began planting questions in casual ways, leaving trails that forced them to reveal their priorities and fears. A simple rema. Arche about the papers, almost incidental, triggered a pause. A fleeting look from her brother hinted at concealed resentment. Each micro-reaction was a thread she could pull later, a key to unseen doors. And she understood, with cold precision, that those who underestimate the quiet observer are often the first to fall. The accident had been her crucible, her forced awakening. She now recognized a broader pattern. Most of life's authority is performed, not earned. Pride masquerades as competence, obedience as loyalty, and love as convenience. People cling to appearances because they fear the collapse of their constructed reality. And in that fear, Elaine found her advantage. She did not need to confront or accuse. She only needed to exist fully aware, letting the quiet tension she generated become irresistible. There is a dangerous beauty in this process. The world is predictable if you watch long enough. Actions, omissions, slips of speech, they all point to hidden truths. Her father's indifference, once excruciating, now revealed layers of secrecy and avoidance. Each revelation, each tiny misstep, was a confirmation of her growing understanding. She had entered a realm few ever see. The space between words, the silence behind gestures, the currents of control that flow beneath the surface of family, trust, and authority. And here she paused, realizing something almost intoxicating, her own transformation. 3 weeks ago she had been the patient, the helpless, the overlooked. Now she was a strategist, fully awake, quietly orchestrating without exposure. The papers were not just documents, they were her signal, her silent affirmation that she was no longer a pawn. And in that understanding she whispered to herself, reinforcing her awakening, "I am seen, I am prepared, I am inevitable." At this moment, Elaine understood the subtle mechanics of control. One does not wrest power from others by brute force. One bends reality by perception, by awareness, by cultivating the silent knowledge that the world responds first to those who are awake, while others sleep. As her family continued, blissfully unaware, she felt the intoxicating thrill of inevitability taking root in every interaction. Elaine had reached a threshold few ever cross, the point where observation becomes orchestration. Her family had no idea that every gesture, every word, every hesitant glance was catalogued, analyzed, and transformed into a map of influence she now controlled. The papers, once inert, had become instruments, tools of quiet power, waiting for her to apply them with precision, and she knew exactly where to begin. The first overt cracks appeared in subtle ways. Her father, in a conversation about a routine family matter, overexplained himself, revealed hidden assumptions, and exposed decisions he thought were buried. Her siblings, normally composed and confident, betrayed small signs of discomfort, a hesitation in speech, a fleeting look of unease. These were not accidents, they were the predictable reactions of people who had built authority on appearance rather than understanding. And Elaine, now awake in a way that was both terrifying and exhilarating, absorbed every detail. It was not malice driving her, but clarity. Each subtle interaction was designed to illuminate weaknesses, to expose the unspoken hierarchies and hidden dependencies that had long governed their relationships. The accident, the betrayal, the weeks of pain, they had forced her into a position of unparalleled awareness. And with awareness comes inevitability. Those who are blind to the currents around them cannot resist being guided by them. In her quiet, deliberate way, Elaine began leaving traces. Questions phrased to provoke reflection, statements that hinted at knowledge she had no right to possess, small gestures that unsettled her family without ever revealing her hand. Each subtle move was a probe, a test of strength, of pride, of fear. She watched as patterns emerged, as weaknesses revealed themselves in real time. And she realized something almost intoxicating. People are never honest under pressure. Their true nature surfaces when they believe they are unobserved. At the midpoint of this story, I want you, the viewer, to participate in this transformation. Comment below twice the phrase, "I see the hidden currents." Repeat it. Let it anchor you. Let it mark the moment where you stop being passive and start observing the subtle mechanics of power in your own life. This is no ordinary comment. It is a recognition, a commitment, and a signal to yourself that you are awake. Elaine's transformation mirrored that moment for you. She had moved beyond hurt, beyond betrayal, into something stronger: clarity, patience, and an understanding of the invisible mechanisms that govern human behavior. And now, the stage was set for the next move, the one that would reveal how deep her awareness truly went, and how irreversible the change had become. The moment of reckoning arrived not with a scream, not with confrontation, but with a quiet inevitability. Elaine, who had been underestimated, dismissed, and ignored, now held the weight of knowledge and clarity in her hands. The papers were no longer mere documents. They were instruments of influence, a map of vulnerabilities she had carefully traced over 3 weeks. And tonight she would see the first results of her silent orchestration. Her father, once so certain of his authority, faltered under the subtle pressure she applied. A simple question, almost casual, about a detail in the documents caused a twitch in his composure, a hesitation that betrayed his inner recognition. He had been seen fully for the first time in decades. Her siblings, who had once skirted responsibility and accountability, began to reveal cracks in their own armor, small admissions, fleeting confessions, signs of discomfort that Elaine had been quietly eliciting. Each reaction confirmed the truth she had known all along. Control is not taken with anger, it is cultivated with perception. Elaine allowed herself a slow, deliberate smile. The transformation was complete, not just hers, but theirs. They had been guided, exposed, and altered without realizing it. Their arrogance, their complacency, their assumptions about her weakness had all been turned against them in the most elegant and precise way. And in that precision lay a deeper truth. The world bends to those who see, who calculate, and who act with patience, while others remain blind. She reflected for a moment on the weeks that had led here, the accident, the betrayal, the endless hospital hours that had forced her into observation and reflection. Every ounce of suffering had been a lesson, every slight a teacher. And now, standing metaphorically at the apex of that transformation, Elaine realized the final, undeniable fact. Power resides not in those who shout the loudest or act impulsively or demand attention. It resides in the one who quietly sees the truth, who anticipates, who waits, and who acts with inevitable precision. In the silence that followed, she whispered to herself, a mantra that cemented the change. I am seen. I am prepared. I am inevitable. It was not a threat, it was a statement of understanding. And somewhere deep in that quiet, the world shifted, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in the currents beneath the surface, in the minds and hearts of those who had once underestimated her. Elaine had not just survived, she had awakened, transformed, and mastered the space between observation and action. And now, as you watch this story, you too have glimpsed a hidden mechanism, the subtle, invisible power of patience, clarity, and perception. Let it settle. Let it awaken something within. Because once you see the currents beneath the surface, once you understand the delicate architecture of influence, nothing and no one can ever appear the same again.